Perspective is one of, if not the most important landscape photography composition technique that you can use to improve your landscape photos. And in this video I will talk about the 5 most important types of perspective, what effect each of them have on your photos, and how you can use them to your advantage when you're photographing. Hi, I'm Kim from Landscape to Art, and I'm here to help you improve your landscape photography, and by focusing on developing your skills as a photographer and less on the gear side of things. And if this is your first time here, make sure you click the subscribe button below. Perspective in photography is about how different objects in a image relate to each other. And changing our perspective, the way we see things, can actually be beneficial in many situations in life, and not only in photography. But in photography, perspective is one of the strongest composition techniques that you can use. When you see the world, we see it in 3 dimensions, whereas photographs is a flat 2-dimensional medium. We use perspective to create an illusion of 3 dimensions and depth in photos. You will have a very powerful way to improve your landscape images as soon as you understand how to use the different perspective techniques. The first type of perspective I will talk about is linear perspective. When we look at parallel lines at a distance, they seem to meet near the horizon. And this is known as linear perspective, and this meeting point in the end is what we call the vanishing point. And the human eye judges distance by the way lines and planes converge. And every photo has a vanishing point, but it can be difficult to see where the vanishing point is when the horizon is not visible. And it's typically easier to see the vanishing point when there are lines of some sort or repeating patterns in the scene. Here is a typical example of the linear perspective. You can see this road here, it gets more narrow the further in the distance it comes until the vanishing point down here. So this is, and also you can see that the trees here are getting smaller and smaller. The closest trees are looking bigger. And here is another example. This fence here, it's leading into where the vanishing point is here back here in the horizon. And also you can see each fence post here gets smaller and smaller. So the vanishing point is here just to the right here. The second type of perspective is diminishing scale perspective, and that means that objects far away from the camera appears to be smaller than objects close to the camera. And our brain knows that the real size of different objects like trees or cars or people or animals. So when we see a person twice as big as another person, we cannot rationally conclude that the person is actually twice as big. So instead our brain tells us that the smaller person is further away from the camera. This is an example of diminishing scale perspective. As you can see, the persons that are closer to the lens here, they look much bigger than those that are in the distance, further away. And that's, so our brain now interpret this as those persons are further away and these are the closest. And here's another example. And I took this example just to show the scale of the photographer compared to the ice. And these ice blocks are quite big really, and we all know the size of a human, and compare them to these ice blocks around him here, it tells that these are significant lumps of ice on the ice beach. And the third type of perspective is overlap perspective. When we see an object blocking the view of another object, we know that the first object is nearer to the camera than the other. And that's another way to increase the 3-dimensionality in photos. And that's by adding overlapping objects in the composition, or more precisely adding layers. This image here is a typical example of overlap perspective. There is no doubt that this iceberg here is in front of the mountain behind, because the mountain is partially hidden by the ice. So that's an example of overlap perspective. And here's another one. And you can see the ship here is behind the iceberg. It's definitely, it's no doubt that it's behind the ice, and it also tells something about the scale here from Antarctica, that this iceberg here is huge, and we all have a sense of how big a cruise ship is. So this is also an example of scale perspective. And the next type of perspective is atmospheric perspective, and the appearance of objects in the far distance is altered by the effects of atmospheric conditions between the camera and the object. So atmospheric conditions like haze or fog or dust in the air will make further away objects less contrasty, and they will have less saturated colors. Here is an example of atmospheric perspective. And as you can see here, that there are layers here of fog and haze in the landscape, but everything that is in the farther distance here near the horizon is more faint than the colors of the trees that are closer to the lens or to the camera. So these layers here is an example of atmospheric perspective. And on the more extreme is aerial perspective, which has become very popular in the recent years. With the introduction of drones, it's possible to photograph from perspectives that was not possible before. Here's an example of aerial perspective, and I could never have done this photo without a drone. So by flying high above the trees, I get a perspective that it's impossible to do without having this drone and fly over the trees. And here's another example. It's hard to see at first what it is, but it's also pine trees from above. So this aerial perspective makes it totally different, and you have a perspective that you've never been able to do before the time you got the drones. So now the question is, how do you change perspective in a composition? Many photographers think that they are changing the perspective just by changing the focal length of the lens. And this is a misunderstanding. By zooming into a longer focal length, you're just magnifying everything in the frame. So the only way you can actually change the perspective is to move the camera in any direction, closer to the subject or further away. And it's very easy to check this yourself. So you can just set your camera on a tripod and take 2 photos of the same object without moving the camera between the shots. Take one photo with a focal length of, let's say, 50 millimeter, and then zoom into 100 millimeter and take the other shot. So now when you crop the 100 millimeter shot in your editing software until the field of view is the same of these 2 photos, you will see that the cropped version looks exactly the same as the 50 millimeter shot. The objects in the 2 photos are positioned exactly the same relative to each other, so you have not changed the perspective. But with that said, it's a fact that different focal lengths have an effect on the perspective, but only when you move the camera closer or further away from your subject. Wide-angle lenses exaggerate the perspective and make objects closer to the lens appear much bigger relative to the background. So, and wider focal lengths emphasize the linear perspective, and this in turn creates an illusion of scale and depth in the image. So this is why many landscape photographers includes a foreground element in their composition, and why wide-angle lenses is a great tool to do that. Telephoto lenses, however, compresses the scene and makes the distance between objects appear less. This reduces the illusion of depth and distance in your photo. If you photograph a subject 5 meters away from the lens at 50 millimeter, you actually have to move back to 10 meters to keep the same field of view if you change the focal length to 100 millimeters. And with this approach, you have changed the perspective, and the wide shot seems to have more depth in it. So when is it beneficial to change the perspective in a composition? It's, for example, if there is something in the middle ground in your composition that is distracting and you want to hide it or make it less visible, you can position the camera slightly lower. And with a lower angle, you will include more foreground in the image, and you will remove some of the middle ground. And another reason to change perspective is if it's an important element in the composition that's obstructed by something with less important. Then you can change perspective by moving the camera left or right or even up or down. In situations where the horizon lines are cutting through important objects in the frame, you can also just change that by moving the camera slightly, in any direction actually, up or down. And if the horizon line is cutting straight through the head of a person, you should try to reposition the camera. Similarly, if anything unwanted is sticking in from the edges of the frame, it can be distracting and intentionally draw the viewer's attention away. So you must be observant when you keep an eye on these things when you make compositions and adjust accordingly. Often just a small little change in camera angle can make or break a good composition. I really hope you found this video helpful and that you have a better understanding of how you can use perspective to improve your landscape photos. The best is of course to go out and practice all this. Try different focal lengths and see what it does to your compositions. And don't forget to move around. Try different camera angles. Actually move your feet. That's the best way to change or change compositions. And now if you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel below. Thank you so much for watching, and as usual, if you have any questions or comments, post them in the comment section below. And until next time, ha det bra, goodbye.